For more analysis on the UK's exit from the European Union, joining us from London is John Petley. He's the operations manager with the Campaign for an Independent Britain. Also with us is Sean O'Grady. He's the deputy managing editor of the London newspaper, The Independent. Here with us in the studio is Tom Clougherty. He's the editorial director of the Centre for Monetary and Financial Alternatives at the Cato Institute. And Gordon Guthrie is a former parliamentary candidate with the Scottish National Party and the author of Winning the Second Independence Referendum, a manifesto for Scotland and EU after Brexit. Thanks to all of you for joining us. John Petley, let me start with you. You are a strong supporter of Brexit. Now, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, has begun the process of withdrawing from the EU. Remind us again why you and others like you believe that Britain is better off outside the European Union.
Well, we've never really fitted in. I mean, we were led into it by Edward Heath, who told us that we were going to be joining a new trading bloc, and he very much downpedaled the aspects of sovereignty, and I think that's left a very bad legacy. I don't think really it's a terribly good idea to have these massive, big international unions like the EU. I think it's much better for nations to be able to direct their own affairs, particularly, I think, in the case of a country like the UK, which has a very different history, a very different legal system, a very different approach to doing so many things than most of our European neighbours. We've always been a square peg in a round hole, and for me, the most important reason why I campaigned and indeed voted to leave the EU was to return to being a self-governing nation again.
Sean, you are on the other side of this debate. Now, given that all that we've heard John say, you had hoped that Britain would vote to remain in the European Union. So, in your view, what does Britain lose now by getting out of the EU?
Well, we don't know, is the short answer. We didn't actually know when we voted last year, and we won't know until this deal is ready. The potential loss is enormous. There would be a gain in sovereignty, as your other guest says, but there's a price to pay for that sovereignty. Right now, what the British government is proposing to do is introduce what they call a Great Repeal Bill into Parliament, which will take 43 years worth of European rules, regulations, laws and that sort of thing, and try and move them all over to British law, or ensure that they do so with some changes and so on. Now, that's all very well, but what happens then? Either we stick with them and we amend them as the Europeans do, in which case we could probably keep trading under single market rules, or anyway, we could trade at lower cost, keep investment, keep jobs, keep prosperity, or we could change them, or the Europeans can change the rules as they go along, which would make trade more difficult and more expensive and more cumbersome and more, difficult, generally speaking, which would be bad for jobs, bad for investment. So there is sovereignty. We may well regain a great deal of sovereignty, but we may well also pay an enormous economic cost for that in the short run. We can control our borders, we can reduce migration. But again, in various ways, there'd be an economic cost attached to that. And so I think all of those arguments are going on. We don't know, though, where we'll end up at the end of that process. We don't know what the Europeans will agree. It takes two to make an agreement. It takes two to tango, as they say. So whatever the British want isn't necessarily what the Europeans want, and vice versa. And the other thing I'd say is that we had a lot of British politicians in the old day. There was a few famous ones from that generation. And one of the most famous things that they came up with as a slogan was that sovereignty is not like virginity. It's not an either or, it's not a binary. You can share it, you can enhance your sovereignty. If you can deal it, you can trade sovereignty, and that's really what the European Union was about. It was rather untidy and messy and undemocratic in many respects, but it was about trading sovereignty. It was the sense in which we would have some say over what happens in other important countries, very important economic markets, very important defence allies in some cases, and they would have some say over us.
Right.
That's true, but for the greater good. So that was the principle of it, and that did go rather out of fashion, but we don't know what we're going to get at the end of this deal.
Right, Gordon, as we talk about the British withdrawal from the European Union, of course, there's also the question of the status of Scotland. If we look at those referendum results, most Scots decided that they wanted to stay in the European Union, but now because they're part of the United Kingdom, there are going to be a lot of disaffected Scottish people who are going to have to follow Britain out of the European Union. There is talk of another referendum for independence that could change the picture, and independent Scotland could decide to stay in the European Union. What happens next for Scotland?
I think, you know, the Scottish Parliament passed a bill proposing a second independence referendum, and the intention is that will be held prior to British exit for the European Union, and my expectation would be that Scotland will vote to leave the UK and remain in the European Union. It's interesting what John was saying. He made a point about the UK has a different legal system from Europe. This is called total nonsense. Scotland has Roman law like the rest of Europe. England has common law. We have this picture that we've been given about Britain joining the European Union is completely false. It's a two-part story. Britain gave up its east of Suez policy, gave up its military projection. East of Suez was the military wing, and joining Europe in the communities was the political wing. And what we're seeing now is a very 1950s fantasy Britain re-emerging of this sort of pretend empire. And what Scotland wants to be is a modern European country. And we're going to do that by remaining in the European Union.
OK, let me give John a very quick chance to respond to what you were saying, Gordon. John, what about the fact that Britain is not that different from the rest of Europe?
Well, if you look at something like our legal system, there are so many checks and safeguards that we have.
Which legal system?
Scotland
is a separate legal system to England. Scotland is a separate legal system, and we have European law. We have continental law, Roman law. I mean, that happens to be a fact.
Well, I can't speak for the Scottish legal system, but I tell you, if you look at something like the European arrest warrant, which is something we do definitely need to have a break from, it's led to people being taken abroad under the whim of some European judge and tried on hearsay evidence, all sorts of things that would never be possible, at least under the English legal system. That's one very big difference for starters.
OK.
To be charged in Scotland, you need to have two witnesses. If you're charged in England, you will be extradited from England to Scotland on one single witness. So we already have different jurisdictions and extradition for criminal charges in the UK. This is nonsense. OK,
I want to move on and let me bring Tom in. Tom's here with me in the studio. Tom, is Brexit going to be good for Britain in the long term?
I mean, I think so much of it depends on what happens now. As Shauna said, we don't know exactly the form that Brexit is going to take. We know that it's going to happen. I'm more optimistic, I think, than some. You know, I think what we always have to remember, and it's very tempting to always see trade in these nationalistic terms, but trade is mutually beneficial. That's why it happens. And it doesn't happen between different governments. It happens between individuals and businesses. I think there's a very strong set of vested interests in Europe for continued free trade, at least in goods going forward. So I don't really see a huge economic break happening. I think what Britain has voted for is something that really became inevitable in 1992 when the Maastricht Treaty came into effect and Europe started to take on the form of a superstate. Its own parliament, its own executive, its bureaucracy, its legal system. And I think Britain was never happy with that. Britain joined the European community. They wanted to be in the common market. Europe has evolved, Britain hasn't evolved with it. I think there was going to be a break at some point, and we can argue over the timing. We can argue over exactly what form that Brexit is going to take, but I do think that there is cause for optimism because there are interests on all sides of this table in maintaining a very close partnership going forward.
You know, as you say, trade is trade, but looking at what is happening right now, some of the sentiments coming out of Europe, it seems that the Europeans want to make it painful for Britain.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things I've been saying to my colleagues is if everyone was rational, if everyone was an economist, this thing would be very easy. We could sort it out next week. Of course, that's not the world we live in.
Right.
These negotiations will be driven as much by politics as by other considerations. And for many European policymakers, particularly those in the EU institutions as opposed to the member state governments, their main concern is the integrity of the European Union. They don't want Britain's exit to encourage others to leave. And of course, there are populist movements, there are Eurosceptic movements all over Europe. So that's a very real concern for them. You know, to put it in colloquial terms, I think Europe will want to extract their pound of flesh during these negotiations. Martin Wolf, the Financial Times commentator, put it quite well yesterday when he said, in order to win in these negotiations, Britain must appear to lose something anyway. What are we going to lose? That's the real question. My guess is that this thing is going to come down to a compromise. How much does Britain insist on controlling immigration from the rest of the EU, on the one hand, and on the other, how much is Europe going to restrict Britain's opportunities to trade services into the European Union. I think goods will be taken care of fairly straightforwardly.
And talking about that view of how Europeans see this, perception, if you like, let's go to John again. John, the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has received that formal notification of Britain's withdrawal from the Prime Minister, withdrawal known as Article 50. Let's take a listen to what Donald Tusk had to say when he got that. Let's watch.
Almost half the British voters wish that we would stay together, not drift apart. As for me, I will not pretend that that I'm happy today. But paradoxically, there is also something positive in Brexit. Brexit has made us, the community of 27, more determined and more united than before.